expert speakers back for a second session on rapid qualitative analysis using the CFIR. One of our speakers, I think maybe our first speaker, the one who's certainly sharing right now, Andrea Nevedal, is a medical anthropologist. A shout out to all anthropologists out there, as I am. As senior qualitative methodologist, she received her PhD in anthropology from Wayne State University and completed a postdoc fellowship funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research at the University of Michigan. Over the last 10 years, she served as an independent contractor on the Veterans Health Administration researcher to train hundreds of researchers on how to use diverse qualitative methods and how to use a consolidated framework for implementation research, 1.0 and 2.0, using rapid qualitative methods. We also have Ms. Caitlin Reardon, who is a qualitative methodologist and developer of both the updated CFIR and CFIR outcomes addendum. She received her MPH from the University of Michigan, which makes sense, School of Public Health, and was trained and mentored by this Laura Dan-Schroeder, the lead developer of the original CFIR. She's worked as an independent contractor and a Veterans Health Administration researcher for over 10 years, using the framework to plan and evaluate the implementation of diverse evidence-informed practices. In addition, she's worked with and/or trained over 100 investigators and analysts in the US and abroad using the CFIR. So I'd like to welcome both of you, and I know we're all very excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much. So I'll start us off here, but then Caitlin and I might go back and forth a little bit here with some of the slides. Thank you for the introduction. I'm just trying to see how to switch to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so just kind of to start off here, I wanted to point out that qualitative methods are integral to implementation science because they help explain the implementation context in detail and help us to explain barriers and facilitators. However, qualitative methods, as you might know, are very time intensive and resource intensive. So in implementation science, more rapid qualitative methods are needed because we need to provide timely feedback to operational partners, to inform next phases of evaluation in research, and to fit within time constraints, which we all, I'm sure, are aware of due to limited grant funding timelines. We personally were driven by difficulties obtaining transcription. We've often experienced delays or, we're unable to get transcription on time. A desire to provide rapid feedback to our operational partners, because a lot of the work that we do, we're working with operational partners, and just general fatigue related to our current traditional qualitative methods using the CFIR. The rapid qualitative methods are really becoming quite common, or at least the searches for them in the literature. As you can see here, there's like a very sharp increase in the need and the use for people wanting to find different references related to this. And a part of this is related to the field of the growing field of implementation science, which relies very heavily on qualitative methods. But we wanted to point out that most rapid approaches have used a broader interview questions and topics as the category rather than doing the rapid approach using a framework at the beginning. And so when you use broader interview questions or general topics that are not using the construct from the framework, it requires a second step of mapping your results to the framework later. So it does kind of like slow down that rapid approach, because once you do the synthesis, you have to sort of link it back to the framework. And in addition, most of the rapid analysis approaches have relied on using transcripts. So it's you're summarizing the transcripts. And so we wanted to do something different. And so that's what we'll talk about today. Our objective for today is to provide a basic overview of the rapid directed content analysis using the CFIR that we developed. We have a published paper that's up here on the slide, which will give you more of the information about the trade-off between the traditional CFIR approach that we used and the rapid CFIR approach. And we developed this approach because traditional CFIR-based coding and analysis was just too time, labor, and resource intensive for the quality improvement projects that Caitlin and I were working on together and with our team. And it was just too intensive. We needed a way to streamline our approach, and we wanted to be able to test to see if rapid qualitative methods would still be effective and useful and rigorous for our needs and to help us save some time. So in addition to kind of just describing this approach overall, we will also point out some different considerations to determine whether or not a rapid approach is useful to you and whether or not it's appropriate. Because one thing we really want people to know is that rapid qualitative method doesn't mean it's easier, and it doesn't mean that it's better for people who are less skilled at qualitative method, that it's still intensive, but in shorter blocks of time. And so that's just something we want people to be mindful of. And the approach that we talk about today doesn't have to be used with just CFIR, it can be used with other frameworks as well. So last week we talked about the CFIR. We have a few CFIR slides here in case people didn't attend, but I'm not going to focus on these. So just more for like your reference here, that the CFIR is a determinant framework. It defines constructs across 5 domains and the potential influences on implementation. So again, here are the domains, in which Caitlin did a wonderful job going over last week. So now I'd like to just give a basic overview of some of different rapid analysis considerations before we go into the actual process. So we wanted to share these considerations because we really want you to think about if rapid approaches are useful to you or your team or in the future or your current work. The one thing to think about is using a framework of the CFIR in rapid analysis appropriate for your study? In our case, using the CFIR was helpful because it is a comprehensive determinant framework, which reduces the risk of overlooking key constructs, and it helps researchers when sharing and comparing results across studies, which we were doing for a longitudinal evaluation. We had to evaluate cohorts over time, and we wanted to be able to compare the implementation rates over time as well. And one thing that we will also point out is that even though we start off deductively using constructs from the CFIR, we also incorporate inductive constructs as well, things that might be relevant that are not covered in CFIR that are particularly important for a particular evaluation or study. Something else to think about is your team's expertise and familiarity with the CFIR. So one thing that we want to kind of mention is that we only recommend, or we kind of just want people to know that this approach really is better if you have a solid foundation in the CFIR or whatever framework you're using, because you need to be able to rapidly synthesize information sort of during the interview and shortly after, or even if you take a little bit of a break and you go to do it, you really need to know like what the CFIR constructs are and how to link and summarize the data that you collect in the interview with the CFIR constructs. And if you don't have that foundation, it can be more challenging when doing a rapid approach. And that even for skilled researchers, rapid analysis requires a high level of effort and cognitive load during the analysis phase. So when we're doing this work, we often have like a 3-hour calendar block where we'll conduct the interview, then spend an hour or two just typing up all of our notes that we have, and then linking the notes to the CFIR construct and the matrix. So it's sort of a very intensive block of time that we try to do. And we often recommend doing this immediately after the interview while information is fresh in your mind. You kind of always, there are cases where we both have said, our calendar doesn't allow for that. And so you can make adjustments. And then the other thing to think about is a rapid approach. If you're using notes and audio recordings, it really does require, it basically provide more of a bigger picture view, and so it has less detailed and transcript-based approaches. So if your project requires a high level of detail or long quotations, then a rapid approach may not be appropriate for you. So our rapid CFIR approach provided less detail, but in doing so, it may have allowed us to see both the overall patterns and the important details in our data more efficiently. So in other words, it's like seeing the forest and the trees. And then another thing to think about is if you want to do a rapid approach, you could think about if this is a new project or an extension of a prior work or a previous project. So with our rapid approach, it was beneficial because we already had a code book and rating criteria developed from the prior cohorts of our evaluation. So it was doing the rapid approach was kind of like a spin-off of the initial work that we did with traditional qualitative methods. And just very briefly, I just wanted to point out the context in which we developed this approach and we tested it out. And so this is related to the diffusion of excellence evaluation, which is a longitudinal evaluation that we're both part of, and it's still ongoing. It's been going on since 2016. So the diffusion of excellence in the VA provides an infrastructure to support implementation and spread of evidence-informed practices that are developed by the Veterans Health Administration employees and for new facilities to implement these practices with about 6 months of support. It's just a very basic sort of overview of the evaluation context. So we just wanted to point out here just the traditional CFIR qualitative analysis process and the key difference between the traditional and the rapid falls here in the center, in the green, in the data analysis section. And that's what we'll focus mostly on today, is the rapid data analysis process. With data collection, is pretty similar, where you conduct the interview. And then the interpretation part is about the same as well, but it's really the data analysis piece here that's different. So traditional approaches, we had the data transcribed, we developed a CFIR code book, we coded the transcripts using qualitative software, and then we spent a lot of time aggregating hundreds and hundreds of pages of transcript and coded data, and then we rated the data as well. So here I just have a basic overview of what the rapid analysis approach looks like, and then we'll go through each step together. And Caitlin and I will sort of a trade-off on describing the process. So just for a visual here, step one is where the primary analyst who does the interview will write their notes and develop that initial matrix. Then step two, a secondary analyst will listen to the audio recording and refine the matrix. And then step three is when we come together and we discuss the changes that were made to the matrix and make any refinements to the analysis process or the definitions or the way that the matrix looks itself. And so just overall, some just key considerations to think about is that rapid analysis is usually more of like an immediate analysis. Like I mentioned, the calendar blocks. There is more of an increased cognitive load because you're doing more intensive bursts of analysis rather than longer periods over time. And you might want to also consider the trade-off between using recordings versus transcripts, which we'll focus on the recordings piece today. And it may also include steps 4 through 6, which are not on here, but we'll talk about that. And that's about when you do that more interpretive step after developing the matrix. And that's when you rate the CFIR constructs. Now we'll just kind of walk through each of the steps in detail, and I'll pass it over to Caitlin.
Thank you. So this was the the sort of first step, like Andrea said, and it really ends up consolidating, or you're doing simultaneous sort of data collection and, in my mind, analysis. So while the interview is happening, handwriting those notes as best as I can in my handwriting, and actually usually tagging those notes in parentheses really briefly with a sort of like CFIR construct at that point. Then immediately after the interview, again, using that longer calendar block to sort of copy those notes into the CFIR by site matrix. So essentially aligning the sort of chunks of notes that were written into the actual matrix. And I'll note that the reason that these were handwritten notes was just because of the recording, right? Essentially, and not wanting to, hear typing during the actual interview process. There was also pretty good use of analytic notes while doing this process, and by that I mean sort of just adding with for me a CR note if I had any questions that I wanted the secondary analyst or Andrea to really pay attention to, I needed any more details, and then also to request timestamps, which was especially important when we were doing this several years ago because we had no sort of automated transcription through Microsoft Teams. We have that now. They're often terrible, but it's so nice to be able to kind of get those timestamps associated with any quotations that you might want. And then the last sort of part of this is sort of starting to develop and build a site summary. So we do this at the top of our matrix associated with the site that we're working within, to just sort of trying to get this overall picture of, what's going on, with this site at this, during this time period. So I'll note that the goal here is really, descriptive summaries rather than interpretive, just based on the notes from the interview. Relatively small sort of time and money savings in this step compared to the traditional analysis. The coding or sort of like aligning the notes in the matrix is roughly the same, but with the rapid approach, you don't have to, create a project or a code book in specialized qualitative software. You don't have to wait for transcripts, which was, for us anyway, a really, really big barrier. Sometimes it took us several weeks to receive transcripts, not having to de-identify transcripts. And then also saved, resources in terms of our project budget because we didn't have to pay for transcription and we didn't need to access any specialized software. Our primary and secondary roles were consistent about 80% of the time. But we did switch when we were needed, and we actually each had slightly different approaches. So I'll turn it over to Andrea just to kind of talk about how she sort of tweaked or did that process differently.
Yeah, so Caitlin mentioned how when she would typically just take her notes and type directly into the matrix itself, where I often like to do sort of like a brain dump where I just type up everything into a Word document, and then I would start to align the notes with CFIR constructs and Word, and then I would copy and paste it into the matrix. To me, that helped because I don't use the CFIR as much as Caitlin. So at that point in time when we first started doing this, I liked having to see like the interview guide and write my notes alongside the interview guide too, where I could have like some shortcut definitions and things like that to help me with that process.
I'll note too, I don't think I said this, that you know, being able to complete the process directly after the interview was so important. Otherwise it did require re-listening, which at the end of the day, right, only adds the, sort of the other time, the time of re-listening. But it's just something to keep in mind. If it's not possible to just plan on re-listening, but otherwise, I tried. I remember going back a few times to look at handwritten notes, and it was impossible to do it, both because just like the interview was gone, it wasn't fresh in my mind, and also my handwriting is really, really horrible. So that's something to keep in mind. So here is an example. This is like a snippet of what the matrix for this facility would look like for just a couple of constructs. And you'll see in here the use of red text, where I'm basically, putting my hand up and calling help to Andrea, right? Can you pull a timestamp in here? Can you like catch some additional detail here that I missed? So yeah, really just already kind of hoping that because she'll then look at the notes before she goes. So she'll kind of know where help is needed.
Yeah. And so when, as a secondary analyst, what I would do is I would begin reviewing the notes in the matrix prior to listening to the audio, just to familiarize myself with the data and then to flag certain comments if Caitlin, maybe said, I didn't quite, like she said, like a call for help or something like that with this construct, maybe it was a little bit, unclear in the interview or a timestamp, so I'll just pay attention to it. And then I'll listen to the audio recording and then I'll pause often so that I can verify what's in the matrix and edit the notes. I pay particular attention to notes from Caitlin's, and I'll help to verify certain spots of the interview with different timestamps or enhance the summary. And then adding the timestamps is really helpful for linking to the raw data because we don't have a transcript. So just having timestamps in there throughout is really helpful. Just so there's been a lot of times where we're like, oh, did I code that right or whatnot? And I want to go back and just be, listen to the audio again to see if there was something that was missed. I'll use text formatting such as green text, strike through, yellow highlighting to make changes and so that it's clear to the other person what those changes are. Caitlin, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just say for overall, I think I used a really similar process. I know that sometimes I wouldn't actually review the notes listening to prior to listening to the audio, just like sort of those initial interviews to make sure that we, we're on the same page sort of independently. And then also I remember sometimes I literally just forgot. So it was not even intended for rigor, but
Yeah.
But that did happen sometimes.
Yeah. So here we just have an example of what an edited matrix. So after I reviewed the initial one from Caitlin, you can see I've added in some notes in green, some strike through for some possible deletions and some timestamps and some additional relationship coding here. So just to show you, this basically would be what you discuss as a team. You'd meet and talk about, like, do you agree with these changes or not? I'll pass it back over to Caitlin.
Yeah. So essentially, I mean, usually there was very little that honestly needed to be discussed, but I would sort of go through, accept any agreed upon edits. But if there were some things that were unclear that we still needed to circle back around, we were meeting weekly at that time, which actually, like, just saying that, I'm like, oh, Andrew, I miss when we met. We
I
used to meet
know,
so
me
much
too.
more. We were like in such a rhythm together, but to kind of just go through things and then update the code book too, if needed, as time is going on, and that's sort of iterating. So yeah, so the consensus was actually where we realized that there was quite a bit of time saved here as we were coming to consensus on sort of higher level notes in the matrix.
Next slide.
Yeah, go ahead. And so here you can see a sort of cleaned up matrix. We've gotten rid of some of the color and things. So that, yeah, and that we would be considered wrapped up on this particular interview for this site.
So now we'll just briefly talk about the construct rating process and completing these steps and tips, and just different tips to help determine if rating the data even makes sense to you. So far we talked about steps 1 through 3. So rating data for strength and valence is a more interpretive part of the process. So the first part is really you're just describing, you're trying to use the words of the participant. You're not trying to sort of add in the researcher's interpretation. This part of where you're actually rating the data relies on more interpretation. So this is done after the data have been summarized and aligned with the CFIR constructs in the matrix. So rating each construct, per site helps to identify patterns and identify constructs that distinguish between high versus low implementation success. When using this approach, you want to think about the number of sites that you have, because the rating process really is only helpful when you have, 3 or more sites. This is time consuming because you really have to define, all the different elements of the rating for each construct, come up with definitions and have consistency. So we don't really recommend this if you have fewer than 3 sites. It just may not really be worth your time to do that. Something else to think about is that you do want to tailor your ratings for your project, just like you would do with the initial CFIR construct rating from the beginning. Like you'll want to tailor those definitions for your particular project for the ratings as well. And that this is often, it was very iterative for us, really we spent a lot of time doing this, figuring out for each construct, what is, a +1 versus a +2 versus a mix versus neutral. And so it can be very helpful, but you have to really have like clear definitions and work a lot together to make sure that there's that consistency when doing that. And just something to think about as well as whether or not you might want to adapt this. So you could consider dropping the strength from the -2 to the +2 component of the rating and just focus on a positive or negative for the construct as a way to see if it's, has a positive or negative influence on implementation. And another just tip to think about is once you do the rating, if you decide to do that, is that you could also do some color coding in the matrix to help flag which constructs impact implementation. So we often would, you could use green for like things that are helping or facilitating, and yellow and red to identify areas where there might be barriers. And the reason why this is helpful is because it can provide like at a glance what kinds of constructs for the sites or which sites might be struggling more than others or doing better.
So in terms of rating the data, the process overall is somewhat similar in that I'm sort of going through that matrix cell. And at this point, keep in mind that the cell will include data from each transcript or each interview, sorry, not transcript, each interview that has happened. And so it's really kind of looking at that data overall across the facility versus a single person in order to provide that rating. You also provide a rationale in the cell to sort of reference, provide that justification essentially. And then again, write any analytic notes, the kind of calls for help or what do you think, et cetera. There was really, really, really large time savings in this part. I think this is actually where we found that the most time was saved between the traditional and the rapid approach. And this is mostly related to not having to create essentially case memos and not having to then copy and paste those summaries, ratings, and rating rationales from the Word memo into the matrix. And it saves time really just in terms of how and when the data is aggregated. So if you're thinking about, trying to summarize and rate data in a memo, that memo is going to include every piece of coded data for every participant that you talk to for that entire facility, right? And I think Andrea said this earlier, and she was not exaggerating. I mean, we had memos that were over 100 pages long, in part because of the length of the interview, the number of participants, but also because, and I think this is true, across probably many frameworks, but in CFIR, we find that we often are sort of double coding and coding relationships between constructs. That means in a memo, that same, identical piece of data is appearing multiple times under multiple constructs in the memo. And so you're looking at it, each analyst is then looking at each piece of data, the same piece of data sort of repeatedly. But with the rapid approach, the data gets condensed, prior to aggregating by the facility. It's done in that first pass of notes that get entered into the matrix. And we often, with relationships between constructs, they'd be described only once in the matrix. And then there would be a note in another cell that referred back to the description, right? And so you didn't have to sort of like read it in both places. And that eliminated those multiple references. And then the secondary analyst, right, is able to build upon that. So that may have been a bit confusing. We can obviously take questions, but that's where we really found that this process saved us the most time. And so here you can just see the actual kind of like matrix, what it would look like. Now you can see that I've added this rating at the top underneath that summary that has been updated from Andrea previously, as well as a rationale for why I felt that the +1 rating was appropriate.
So then this is where I come back in as a secondary analyst reviewing the rating. So basically I would review and revise the rating and provide any additional information on the rationale or my rationale of whether or not if I had a disagreement or something that I wanted to talk about or whatnot. And then again, like earlier, we use text formatting and different things to highlight any changes so that it's easy to talk about when we meet weekly. And then I'd add any like additional analytic note, things that I was thinking about whether or not the rating made sense and the rationale. And again, like what Caitlin said, that it really does save a lot of time because of how and when the data are aggregated, and that it is a lot easier to rate big picture data in an Excel cell, like a small cell, like that's the chunk that you're rating versus having to go through hundreds of pages to come up with a rating. So it just really does help to save time because you're aggregating it earlier on. And here's just an example of some edits that I had made to the initial rating that Caitlin had, and where I mostly agreed with her, but I had put an asterisk here because I thought I wanted to show that there were some struggles to get to that +1 rating for leaders and motivation, because they had talked about how it was very super challenging to get the support that they needed. So I didn't want to make it seem like it was just, it was easy for them to get, or they were, so I wanted to note that it's a +1, but there were some things going on there to get them there. And that was just for us to be mindful of that. So then we would meet to discuss this. So then after I've added my edits, Caitlin would review again to see if there were any just quick edits that she could just approve and see if she agreed upon. And then if there were things that were left over, then we would meet to discuss any remaining discrepancies and then update the rating criteria as needed. And often it was during those meetings that we had where we would go back and say, we had this initial definition for the +1, with the asterisk versus the +2 or the mixed rating. And that's where we would keep, refining the definitions over time. Here's just an example of sort of like what the final very small snapshot. So obviously this is not a full matrix. This is just one facility's snapshot of what it means for leaders' motivation. And then one thing I would point out too is that, so typically Caitlin and I work together very closely, but sometimes there might be some topics or things like that that might have warranted additional discussion. So we might just highlight those in yellow and say, let's bring it to the larger team. We were working with Laura Schroeder, and so sometimes we would just bring certain things to her and then we talk about it as a group and figure out, what was the best way to move forward with that. And so now that we've sort of walked you through what the rapid analysis process was for us, I'll just wrap up here with some different tips and considerations that I'd like you to think about if you haven't tried this approach before, and to determine if it's a good fit for you. The one thing that I always recommend is having a training data set before dividing up the work, even if we work in teams mostly. So I'm talking about a training data set for a team, but even if you're working alone, you might want to say that, the first, 5 interviews or so with the training data set for yourself as well. So I think you could apply some of the same ideas if you're working by yourself. So it's really important to do this for every project, even if you have lots of experience in rapid analysis or in qualitative methods in general, because you still need to go through the same process of defining how the constructs relate to your project, the ratings, and how you want the look and feel of the matrix to be. So it really helps you when you have a training data set. And what I mean by that is that we might say, you know, the first 5 transcripts or the first 5 audio recordings or interviews, that's what we'll use as a training data set or whatnot, or maybe even pull in some additional challenging interviews as well, because that's always helpful to have, you know, a few people do because they're more challenging to analyze. So a training data set helps you to determine if you're aligning the CFIR constructs properly with the data. And so you can work together, the teams. Are we doing it the same way? Are we doing it differently? How, you know, how could we do this so we can do it in a more consistent way? And by doing that is by developing, you know, important, you know, definition. It also helps you to tailor the construct definitions to your project over time. It helps you to determine the level of detail and the organization of the summaries and the matrix. So some people like to have a lot of bullets, some people like to have short paragraphs. So you have to think about like the look and the feel and balance between having too much information and too little information. You want to be able to think about how you want to document missing information. You always want to do that because you don't want to go back and say, oh, this was blank. So does that mean it wasn't asked during the interview? Was it not applicable to that particular interview, or the person just forgot to do it? So it just really does save time to build up what this process is. And you also want to think about how to prevent errors. And when working with Excel, it's very easy to accidentally type into the wrong cell or to copy and paste information. I don't know, I know that we've experienced that. I'm guessing other people have too. So some things that we've come up with over time is to enter the date of when the notes were entered, like in the column or the row. That can help you keep track of it and save it as a new version every time you enter in like a new site data. You could also highlight the row. I was just doing this earlier today for some rapid analysis that I was doing. So I was highlighting the row that I was working with only just so that I could make sure that I wasn't typing into the wrong spot, or you can hide cells as well. I know this might seem like just very basic Excel 101 information, but it's just something to be mindful of because it is easy to make mistakes as you go along. Well, another thing to think about that we kind of briefly touched about is we often have a key takeaway or a site summary at the top of the matrix for each person or site. And this provides sort of a high-level overview. So for example, in our case, we might describe key factors that affect implementation at a particular site. And then each of those high-level summaries can be compared. And I find these very helpful because if I were to bring this up during a team meeting, we could easily see site 1 versus 2 versus 3. We can talk about it as a group because or even just like if you're sharing the information, because if I were to share the matrix with somebody else, it means if we don't have that, they'll have to read through every single construct to understand what the takeaway is. And I really recommend doing this right away when you initially enter the summaries, because it's just easy to remember after you've entered it all in, or even when I'm writing up my notes in Word, I'll just say, I'll write up a paragraph or two about what the key takeaways are for that particular person or if it's, or for a particular site. And like I mentioned earlier, you really do want to tailor the construct definitions, and you want to make sure that your team understands how to use them. And so we'll often include the definition in the matrix as well, so that way you're not having to just kind of guess what does leadership commitment mean, you know, in our study or in our evaluation. And then you can also add in some additional keywords or topics and things like that to refine the definition over time, things that will kind of trigger your memory as you're doing this. And we also have a section here for other and new constructs, because sometimes they're just like site level characteristics or characteristics related to your evaluation or your study that are other like domains that are important, but that aren't covered in CFIR. So almost every project we have additional things that are added there. And so we just want people to be mindful of that, or even things that maybe are more inductive that you learned as a result of doing the evaluation. So after you did the first interview or a few interviews, you might say, this keeps coming up over and over again. Let's add a new construct or a new domain in the matrix, because this is something that we weren't expecting and it's not covered in the existing data set. So just some tips to be mindful of. And one of the biggest things that I've noticed just from the trainings that I do in the VA that I can also mention at the end, if anyone is interested, we do allow a small portion of non-VA people to attend these like more in-depth rapid analysis trainings, is that people don't know what to do when the matrix is done. They're like, the matrix is done, I'm done now, what do you know, we're done. And so they don't really know what to do. And so I just wanted to kind of give just some very high level tips because we can't go into that next phase of how do you interpret the matrix in detail. So the next steps really depend on what your key goals are for a rapid approach. As we mentioned earlier, using a rapid approach is often more descriptive than it is interpretive, and it can involve a variety of different approaches. So in our case, something to think about is construct analysis. So this is one way to make sense of the matrix, sort of like a next step once it's completed, is to summarize each construct. So we want to understand how findings in our case relate to a theory, a model, or a framework. So, what are the CFIR determinants? So you might take leadership, and summarize that entire, all of the ways people talked about leadership motivation or something like that. And this will help you to identify and describe the barriers and the facilitators related to implementation for a particular construct, whether or not that construct matters or not really ultimately for implementation. Something else to think about is case analysis. So you might want to see how sites or people are similar or different. And so you'll want to consider salience, not just frequency. A lot of times people focus on the frequency piece of, oh, that just came up a lot, so it means it's important. But sometimes things come up a lot and they're actually not very important, or they're kind of minor. And so I always want people to think about the salience of something. And you can also think about frequency and also think about negative cases. And by negative cases, what I mean, those are like more of like an outlier or something. And those can be very salient. And it's very important to be mindful of those, because maybe it's like a unique site that is doing really well that's very different from all of the other sites, or a site that's really struggling in a different way. And so that's something just to be thinking about when you're determining, how are the cases similar or different. And something else that you might want to think about for a rapid analysis is that sometimes you just have to make decisions because you have to do things that are more focused. So you can't even analyze everything that's in the matrix. Sometimes you have to make decisions that you have to focus on a very specific or more narrow research or evaluation question, a particular interview question or a construct, or a particular site or a particular person that you need to focus on. And so you may just say, I'm just going to focus on the small subset of the matrix for now, for whatever the next steps might be. The purpose for focus analysis might also be to inform future data collection. So sometimes we do pre-implementation work and we're like, we need to wrap this up really quickly. Like, what kind of changes or things do we want to be mindful for the implementation phase? And so that's or sampling or planning. Sometimes you might say, we did some rapid analysis now. Okay, we've interviewed these types of people, but they're saying we need to talk to some other people. So now that we've done this analysis, let's come up with some ideas of what other people to include possibly. And what are some key things that we need to ask them? And that could be based on this initial more focused analysis that you do. And it's especially important for longitudinal studies where you may not have a lot of time before the different waves of data collection. For us, we had a yearly cohort as part of the diffusion of excellence. So we didn't have a lot of time to collect the data and do the very in-depth analysis. We needed to be able to do it quickly so that we could move on to the next cohort and to be able to give information to our operational partners. And then the last thing here, just to disseminate information quickly. So like I said, you might just focus on a particular element of the matrix so that you can disseminate it in a call or a presentation or in a paper. And then lastly, I just have a couple more little pointers here about just whether or not using the rapid CFIR approach that we talked about makes sense for you, and ways that you might want to adapt what we talked about earlier. And so that our approach did save us a lot of time and money, but it still was time consuming and intensive. And it's not meant to be a one size fits all approach. So teams should think about if they want to follow the approach that we talked about, or maybe make some adaptations that will further streamline the process. So something to think about is to reduce secondary analysis on some or all of the interviews. But we will point out that if you're less experienced in the CFIR or whatever framework that you're using, it may be helpful to keep the secondary analyst, especially in the beginning as you're learning the constructs. So we don't want people who are not familiar with the CFIR just to have only one person do it, because there's going to be a lot more room for error that's not going to be, analyzed properly. And so just something to think about. But in the case of Caitlin or someone else that's more experienced, that it may not really be necessary because, they know the CFIR very well. You could also focus on using fewer constructs, things that are just most relevant to your study. So you could say that you want to focus on some of the most relevant CFIR constructs for your study. Like we often do this in grants where we might say here's our, maybe 10 key constructs that we are thinking about. And there is now there's the PCAT, or the Pragmatic Contact Assessment tool from the CFIR that was like what we've been doing lately on some different projects is looking at that and saying, okay, should we start with these frequently used CFIR constructs for a rapid approach? Do we want to use these, or maybe we want to add in some new ones and take out some that aren't relevant? So that might be something to think about if you need to do something that's more focused and not include all of the constructs. You may find that you can use other sources of data rather than conducting interviews. That would not have worked for us, but sometimes people might be able to do some other types of analysis, you know, through meetings or observations or other types of work. And you could also think about omitting ratings altogether, or you could streamline and select that you might only rate certain constructs that are most important, or simplify the rating process by having only a primary analyst doing the rating, or only a certain percent that are double rated. And you could also streamline what I mentioned earlier, that maybe just doing the positive and negative influence rather than from the -2 to the +2. So our approach was different from both our traditional CFIR approach and from most of the other rapid analysis approaches discussed in the literature at the time in which this was published. So we have a table here that just compares our rapid CFIR approach to our traditional approach and what some of the trade-offs are. And so both approaches were rigorous and they met our evaluation objectives. So those we didn't include in this table, but we just wanted to highlight some trade-offs to think about. So when you use audio files instead of transcripts, it allows researchers to conduct data collection and analysis simultaneously and immediately, but it does increase the cognitive load, and it's intensive, and it requires larger calendar blocks of time because you want to do it, you know, around the time of data collection while things are fresh. It does eliminate the cost of transcription, the cost of qualitative software, but it does decrease the ease of access to raw data and quotations. So that's why we really want to link in those timestamps and things like that. Oh, I see that there's a question. I think I'm just gonna keep moving along because we're almost done, and then we can ask the question or answer the question then, if that's okay. And one other thing to think about is when you streamline analysis with early aggregation of data, it eliminates each analyst having to independently review hundreds of pages and transcripts, like we mentioned earlier. But it does require expertise in the CFIR, the framework, to be able to describe and align to the CFIR constructs immediately or in a short period of time. And it allows researchers to provide feedback more quickly to teams, partners, funders, but it does decrease the level of detail that can be provided when you give feedback. Then I'm almost done here, and then we can move to questions. So the second table here compared our rapid deductive approach to rapid and more like inductive approaches, approaches that aren't using a framework at the beginning. So we use the CFIR early on in our rapid approach and to inform the whole rapid approach because it is a well-established and comprehensive framework to help us understand various factors affecting implementation. But we also recognize the importance of being open to new insights and constructs. We don't want to just have this like tunnel vision CFIR only. We want to be open to new things as well. And using a framework is helpful because it allows you to compare results across studies, and in our case, across different practices and cohorts, and to understand what affects implementation. And one thing to point out, so sometimes people use rapid work outside of implementation. In implementation work, people are often using frameworks, so that's kind of more of a standard thing that is expected. And in contrast, more inductive approaches can be better suited for more exploratory work, but you may miss out on some already well-known constructs. And you also have to, if you want to, basically you'll have to do that extra step of mapping the topics or domains to existing frameworks after the fact. So if you start off inductively, you come up with what your results are, and then you have to say, okay, how do these results relate to the broader literature versus kind of starting with the framework construct at the outset. And then, yeah, just to wrap up here, we just want to point out how our work relates to the broader field here, in that it builds off of the work of Jennifer Neal and our friends and colleagues, Allison Hamilton, or Dr. Allison Hamilton and Dr. Randy Gale, and just wanted to put up a memory of our dear friend here. And I also wanted to acknowledge our amazing team that made all of this work for the evaluation possible, and the important funding that really allowed us to be able to do the rapid methods that we developed. And thank you. And then I'll just show that I have some references here that might be helpful, and some area, the ones highlighted in yellow are the ones related to like our evaluation and the rapid work.
Andrea and Caitlin, thank you so much. So we have a couple of minutes for questions, and then I forgot to mention that if you're part of the EHE group that's sort of funded through the CFIR right now, CFIR, if you want to stay on after, if you have some specific questions for Andrea or Caitlin, you're more than welcome to. But I think we'll start with Hannah because your hand is up.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I found it very interesting. Last year, I completed a brief contract at the VA where my colleague and I used the rapid approach and CFIR with some interviews. And just want to say we kind of did it a little bit differently in the sense of we used Teams to complete our interviews, and Teams has automatic transcription. And so we found that to be very helpful because I really struggle to take notes while I'm talking to someone. It just didn't work for me. So we actually used the automatic transcription in Teams. And so that allowed us to review our transcription afterwards if necessary. But we could also just look at the recording. It was important to go into Stream because Stream is where your Teams recording is placed. So we downloaded our transcript and our recording from Stream and put it into a safe folder for storage. And then my colleague and I each independently read the transcript or listened to it and filled out a summary document that was kind of more detailed, and so forth. And then we had our matrix similar to how you described, and then we both came together and met and came to an agreement as to what to put into the matrix. And overall, it seemed to work pretty well. Like, we both really enjoyed it. It wasn't cumbersome and it wasn't very time consuming. Neither of us had to have a software, qualitative software. And honestly, it took about an hour to complete the interview and maybe 30 minutes to an hour to complete the analysis. And then we would come together and we would come to an agreement, and that also maybe took 30 minutes to an hour. So per interview at most, it took one of us 3 hours and the other one 2. And yeah, we really enjoyed it. So I read your publication, really enjoyed it. And I also participated in the VA RREAL, I think real seminars. I downloaded them I'm pretty sure it was available to anyone. I have all the PDFs and I reviewed those and I found them very helpful. So thank you for the presentation. Found it interesting.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. But I'm glad that you've had a good experience with the rapid approach.
We did not have Teams when we did this. This was pre 2020
Yeah.
and therefore pre the VA learning how to work in a virtual environment. So we now do use Teams to record, and I actually, I'll be honest, my process has changed for this. I just don't have I cannot stand a 3-hour calendar block anymore. I'm going to be honest, post-COVID, I'm like, my brain, I'm just not, I just can't. And I will actually wait and do my analysis later. I'll re-listen and I'll have downloaded the transcript, and then I'll actually type my notes and I'll put them at the top of that transcript, where you can then do a quick search to find quotations, which sometimes they're like horrible, right? Like the transcript is not perfect, but Teams has been I'm so happy that we have that, because I was a different person when we did this. I don't feel like I could go back. Like, I'm like, oh, I can't believe we did that. Like, it was so cognitively challenging to do the notes, do the interview. I'm really glad we've got that we have the Teams now. But yeah, that was pre-2020.
Now, I might be a little bit old school because I don't usually ever use the Teams transcription. I just rely on my notes, but I take a lot of notes. That's just sort of how I work. So I think that what I usually do is I usually recommend that people really understand that Teams, the quality is not going to be the same as getting it professionally transcribed. And so I wouldn't want someone to think that just rely on the transcript from Teams without listening to the audio to make changes. So I'm always just very mindful of that, but I understand that it can be helpful for people just to help supplement the notes or as like a basic starting point when listening to the audio.
For sure, because I cannot take any notes while interviewing people. It's just,
Yeah.
I can't take away my focus from speaking to them. It's just my brain doesn't work that way. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
It looks like we have a question from Kim.
Hi, thank you so much. This was really, really great to get inside your process. So, have to confess, I'm not a convert yet to rapid analysis. I'm still really wedded to traditional, even though I do some implementation science. I teach in an implementation science certificate program at UCSF, and a lot of my students are really intrigued by rapid analysis, and yet they're very new to the enterprise of qualitative research. And I wonder if there's any insights that you might be able to share around. I feel like, Andrea, you were cautioning execution of this method for people who are new to qual analysis. Maybe I wanted to hear that. And anyway,
Yeah.
I guess, what kind of advice do you think I should be sharing with my students about how to leverage this process in a way that's, rigorous and is a good steward of the data, so that you're not doing a overly superficial analysis?
Yeah, I mean, we were trying to be very mindful of that when we put out this publication too. I really would I want to add in information here that tells people not to do it because I think it's an easy, fast, cheap shortcut and that you don't need experience, because that's something that I hear a lot from people all the time, oh, I don't know how to do qualitative methods, so I'm going to do rapid because that's just the easy, cheap thing, cool thing to do. So, but I do try to caution people, but I also don't want people to be afraid to try something out. And I wish that I had more rapid approaches in some ways, thinking back on when I was doing my dissertation, I had to transcribe all of my own work. And I sat there, and I mean, it took me 6 months to transcribe all of my interviews. And there's a lot to be learned from doing that because you're listening to the audio and you're typing it out. And so I guess what I would say is that people shouldn't be afraid to try it, but they really need to know that there are going to be trade-offs. It's going to be a higher level view of what people said, and then really to make sure that there are links to the raw data, and to maybe just keep it simple, more focused. It's one thing we didn't talk a lot about here, and we talk about this more in the in-depth trainings that I help facilitate in the VA that are 6 hours long, is that a rapid approach is not meant for a very exploratory work. So if your questions are all over the place, you really can't do comparisons. It's hard to have a matrix because every single interview is going to be different. So it really should be something that's the interviews won't be as long. It's a much more focused topic, much more focused type of interview. And then if someone is new to rapid analysis and maybe they want to keep the study topic maybe a little bit easier to understand and to summarize, if that makes sense, is a starting point as well. If they don't know the CFIR or they don't know a complicated framework and they're trying to do that in a rapid way, I think that is going to be very tricky to do. So if it's something that's more straightforward, well, what do you like about this program? What don't you like about this program? Or what, things like that. I think that's a little bit more it's less abstract and it's a little bit easier to be able to summarize. So hopefully that gives you some tips and ideas to think about. And I'm happy to answer more questions too, and you can always email me as well. Caitlin, do you want to add anything?
I would second that. I think you said it perfectly. The thing I would reiterate is thinking specifically about rapid and CFIR is that I would definitely not recommend it unless that person is really familiar with CFIR, has already used it in the sort of more traditional sense, using transcripts, because context is tricky, right? There's a lot of ideas that are related to each other, that are overlapping. And I think to teach it, you really need to teach it while you need transcripts. And I can say this because I am training somebody right now and we don't have transcripts, and I have we're getting there, but she honestly has she even has some experience, and it's just I miss transcripts. So I think if you're new to the framework, if you're not dreaming in it, I wouldn't try it, right? Personally, because I was I was really writing notes and tagging them with constructs at the same time, and I don't know you can't do that if you don't know the framework well.
So helpful. Thank you both so much.
And Christine.
Thank you. This was a very timely presentation. I'm considering using this approach for a single arm hybrid type 1 intervention pilot that I'll be doing as soon as my funding gets released. But I'm thinking about using this for intervention adaptations. So I'm going to be doing a brief I'll do the intervention, do a brief 15 to 20 minute interview about how we can improve the intervention and just overall implementation barriers and facilitators to consider from participants. So I'm thinking this would be a really good use of this, and I am very familiar with CFIR and qualitative analysis, but then I'm also going to be recording the intervention, which is an advanced care planning, trauma-informed advanced care planning conversation. I'm going to record that and then do more, traditional qualitative analysis of that for, themes and all of that. But I see, of course, experience of team members being really, really important with this, as well as what the purpose of it is important to consider. This isn't going to fit everything, just like traditional qualitative methods won't fit every qualitative question that is out there. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you walking us through the process.
Yeah, and one other thing to think about too, some people have asked me, and I've done this on projects too, sometimes that even if we have a project that's more focused and that we plan to do rapid analysis, sometimes we also have some exploratory questions, but maybe those questions we don't analyze in a rapid way. So we might just still get transcripts anyways, and then we can always go back to the data where there are, more of like a grand tour question or something that's much more like exploratory or about people's experiences, and you could say, well, that doesn't really make sense to do rapidly, but we can save that for later, and we can do that at another time, and then we'll do this other part that the bulk of the questions are more focused.
That's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd say for you too, Christine, you were asking about interview guides earlier. With such a short interview, I would probably, this is sort of like an aside, I would probably do like non-construct specific data collection, like you said, like just sort of barriers and facilitators, and asking that open-ended. And I think that's actually like a side point of using CFIR, is that lots of folks actually don't necessarily use it during data collection, but use it during analysis. And I think that could be especially useful for you if you're really trying to like come in and get like overall barriers and facilitators and don't necessarily have really specific constructs you want to target in such like a brief short interview.
Thank you.
So we've hit the top of the hour. If there's anyone with an EHE project that wants to stay on and chat with Andrea and Caitlin, you're more than welcome to. I actually have to pop off, so I apologize. But Hina will stay on. Otherwise, thanks so much for joining us and for leading these 2 sessions.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and like Caitlin said, we love email, so you're welcome to
Thanks for having
contact us.
us.